Amalsha. I'm the acting program manager at the African Doctoral Academy. This is our first webinar for this year. We just finished our almost 4-week-long summer school last Friday, which was very successful. And yeah, really went quite well. So a lot of you, if you have joined us at the ADA, would know Dr. Skinstad. She has co-presented the Introduction to Qualitative Research Methodology course, as well as the advanced course with Prof. Wayne Babchuk. So she is definitely a familiar face at the ADA. She is currently at the Department of Sports Science at the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences. And she just finished her PhD last year and went through this whole process. So we thought it would be really interesting to have her do a webinar for us on her experience. So like I mentioned before, we have a little bit of a technical issue and we're not able to figure out what's going on. So we've come up with a very, very innovative way to try and get this going. So I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to hope that it works. So let's see. Okay. Share sound. Let's see. Can you please confirm if you can see my screen as well as hear me? Lauren, Brian?
Yes, I can see your screen. I can hear you.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Let me just take, Deb, can you still hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear. Can everyone else hear me?
I can hear Deb.
Oh, thank God. Okay. So this is basically online Zoom Microsoft Teamception, basically, because I'm on a call with Deb on Teams right now and I'm sharing my screen. So yeah, talk about being creative. Anyways, let me not delay this any further. Deb, are you able to continue then? You can share, you can, I think, use presentation mode.
Okay. Just a random, hello colleagues, I'm so sorry for the runaround. Can you, I'm literally seeing Lauren and Amalsha on Zoom right now.
Yes, you
so
can.
I feel like I'm connected. Am I connected?
No, because I'm sharing my screen, so you can see what's on my screen. Like if I minimize it, you won't see it now.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you get, so you guys can hear me though?
Yes, I can, and I think everyone else can. Let me just check the chat. Yes, everyone can hear you. Okay, Deb, you're good to go. Let's.
Fantastic. So we are in presentation mode. All right. Good morning or afternoon, colleagues. I'm terribly sorry for the runaround. It's been a little bit interesting on this side. What I would like to share with you right now is really my journey from start to finish. Now I've put there Dr. Skinstad pending because I want to just give you the behind the scenes scoop that I've gone through the examination process. I've defended my PhD. But at the same time, I've got to go through, faculty board, I believe, and also through Senate. So that's all going to be approved before I can actually graduate officially in April of this year. So a warm welcome to you all. I'm really grateful for this opportunity, and I'd like to make it as user-friendly as possible. A massive shout out to Amalsha, who's been working hard behind the scenes. I was not expecting these technical errors. To be honest, this hasn't happened to me before. So let's see if we can proceed, and I would love to hear your questions and discussions and engagements later on. All right, so behind the scenes of a qualitative PhD dissertation, tales and tips learned from process to product. So a little bit of a index here. So I'm going to give you a bit of background, some challenges that I faced. And then the real nitty gritty was the growth and development, so the process. And then the product was examination and defense, which again, the final product, I guess you can say, is going to be when I actually graduate and make it all official. So what you'll notice here is a lovely little collage of my tennis background. So the reason I'm showing that to you is because so often with qualitative research, at least from my experience, there's a lovely integration, you know, between the researcher as the budding, you know, PhD or master's degree or person, I should say, kind of in pursuing this particular journey. But then there's also the deeper layer, which is you. So this is me back in the day, a much younger Deb, when I went to Tulsa, Oklahoma on a full scholarship. I was fortunate enough to have that lovely experience, but that really shaped my journey as a semi-professional tennis player. Then I went on, you know, to shape my journey actually as a researcher as well. I was able to pull from these lovely reference points. So I went the US collegiate route in terms of my tennis playing experience, and that will come into the fore a little bit later as we kind of unpack my journey and just remember why it was so important. So a big team aspect within an individual sport like tennis, which made for certainly an interesting journey on the tennis court and off the court as well. So back to the beginning of my project. In the early days in 2017, I submitted my proposal and notice the language. So I've gone through very similar presentations, fortunately with the ADA as a co-instructor or co-presenter with Prof. Wayne Babchek. And when I get the opportunity to present, I really like to kind of unpack my own journey as a budding qualitative researcher and hopefully a budding qualitative research methodologist. So notice the language around my original proposal. It was a systems perspective. I was heavily immersed in systems theory, the dynamic interplay between relationships, but then again, the directional language as well. So that's important for a qualitative researcher because I had this, which I didn't know at the time, this directional language essentially that was being influenced from a very objective way of looking at the research problem. So I was under the impression that these youngsters, these tennis playing youngsters, were dropping out of the sport. So prior to me even entering the field, I had already, you know, in a way, which has come to find out later on as a researcher, you know, moving into more and more specializing in research, was actually a big faux pas on my part because I had already come to a conclusion prior to even entering the field, because I had, you know, looked at the problem a specific way and almost envisioned an outcome, but that wasn't actually what was happening. And that's the beauty of, you know, qualitative research that I would like to, you know, share with you more and more as we go through this. So again, the language around this was, I was convinced that how our young men were dropping out of the sport, and the focus there being on South African men's tennis within the province of the country. Notice again the language around, you know, kind of vague to understand and describe tennis development on and off the court, influencing decisions. So again, there's a big underpinning of what decisions were made. Either they made the decisions or, you know, decisions were made for them. Irrespective of that, the language around the original project or original proposal was certainly not well suited to a qualitative investigation by no means. So I'm sharing this with you right now because this has all come from, you know, my methodological journals, research, my original research proposal that was accepted with a title actually that was accepted at the time, went through all ethical clearance. But then when I went into the field and I started to grow, I started to grow as a researcher and as a person really. I started to be heavily invested in, you know, what I call the influences of youth sport literature. So I would read these articles by, you know, the top names in the industry, your Neeru Jayantis of the world. He's an MD out of Emory University. And I got kind of up close and personal with these experts. I reached out to them on social media and they gave me a lot of their time and energy, so to speak, and invested in, really sharing with me their research and why, why their research was important, how their research had influenced the way they looked at the problem. But again, if you notice, just, maybe you may or may not know these phenomenal scholars. But the key here for me was being in the southern tip of Africa and then, consulting Western literature. They're really good and certainly influential. I had to really grapple with, well, do I want to come to the table, to the fore of my own project, being heavily influenced by, the Western world? Now, there are many pros and cons to that. So I decided, well, maybe to read what I needed to read, to have a good handle on the literature, the broad literature base, and see how it would actually apply to South African tennis, but specifically to the Western Cape. So, for example, when I was chatting to Dr. Cote, Prof. Cote now, he very gladly responded to my emails and said, Deb, I've done these interviews, but the interviews themselves with these, sports people, so to speak, is a quantitative interview. Now, that language of quantitative and interview, come to find out, didn't sit well with me. It became quite confusing because essentially I was looking for metrics, I was looking for numbers, I was looking for performance markers. And these particular quantitative interviews, again, I emphasize that, would really get to the heart of tracking time, investment, activities within young people's sport. And I could gladly use it and adapt it, which I did with my pilot studies. But I found that I was missing the mark. There was something that I hadn't explored regards to the person that was, the tennis player, so to speak, that I needed to kind of unpack, which led me to a lot more reading, colleagues, led me to a lot of reading, and a lot of self-doubt, to be honest, because here we have the experts have done, their projects, one way, with a big quantitative emphasis. But again, I went back into my methodological journals and I really decided, well, Deb, what is it that you want to look at? And this particular, little segue or quote from Andre Agassi, an all-time, Grand Slam champion, in his autobiography, he says, I never questioned my father's love. I just wish it were softer, with more listening and less rage. In fact, I sometimes wish my father loved me less. Maybe then he'd back off, let me make my own choices. Having no choice, having no say about what I do or who I am makes me crazy. Now notice, this is a world-class tennis athlete, Grand Slam champion, years in the making. But in his autobiography, you come to find out that this was this kid with a dream, and he, through his tennis, at least from the scene that was depicted from this quote, was that it really came out of the context of a little guy trying to attain his father's approval from the sport or through the sport that he was playing. And that really stuck with me. It stuck big time, colleagues, because I started to question, am I after the performer with all these metrics and ranking points and stages of development? It's been done before. Do I really want to reinvent or really take that and reinvent the wheel, so to speak, on my end using Western literature? Or did I really want to uncover what the person is doing on and off the court? So what happened then was, this encouragement from my supervisory team to say, well, Deb, with the deepest amount of respect to you, you've come out of, of the States, 12 years stateside, but you don't really have a good grapple on what it means to be a researcher. So I decided to enroll myself in, I've got the lovely little plug here for African Doctoral Academy, and I do that on purpose every time I give this, because honestly, colleagues, when I say this, I'm being truthful, that these particular courses revolutionized the way I was thinking around research and also as a young aspiring academic. So in 2018, I enrolled in Prof. Gooderman's mixed methods course. I went ahead in 2019 with his quantitative course, and then something just, the light bulb just went on when I enrolled 2019, 2020, and again in 2020 with advanced qualitative research, where I started to see exactly what I was after. The ability now, the toolkit, so to speak, to really unpack the person who was also wearing the hat of tennis player. So I had to really grapple, and this is what I love about what we call the confessional tales of qualitative research. I had to be honest with myself. Yes, I have skill sets. Yes, I'm good at a couple of things, as we all have our skill sets. But what I was lacking and what I really needed for my project at the time was a deeper philosophical foundation. So I have a personal philosophy, I have a personal value system, but I really, needed to grapple with how to find the best fit. So in order to design a research project for qualitative research and or any other research project, sometimes you're called upon to be, explicit. In this case, I needed to be explicit, but how could I be explicit about the philosophical worldview, or the paradigm, as some scholars call it, without having one, or at least without knowing I had one for myself? So therefore, the research design was vague. We often use, generic terms like descriptive. Well, we can have a lot of descriptive studies. Let's kind of seal the deal, so to speak, and be explicit around our language. And this is what, Prof. Wayne has taught me over the years, Prof. Babchek has taught me, with the scripts that we can use from the language, the beautiful language around research. So, which led me then to uncover, what are these philosophical worldviews? There are many more out there, but what research design can really latch on to these worldviews, and how can you make it what we call congruent and coherent from both your, process to product, essentially. And that's really what I had to sort of grapple with. So I landed on a constructivist qualitative research design, and I'll unpack that slightly a little bit more as we delve into this. So again, looking at the scholars and really investing in the research methodology aspect of this, I looked at Cresswell's work, Prof. John Cresswell, and he's very big on the practical implications, but the practical sort of mapping techniques that we see, how he can make your project congruent and coherent all the way through, because there is a big explicit nature of a qualitative project, and once you've got that part down within your, I believe it's chapter 3, your methodology section, it needs to link up with all the rest of the document, and that's what came to the fore as I was producing this document, and even into my examination process, which I'll get to in a little bit. So I use this as a template for myself to say, well, Deb, let's map it out for you. What is your worldview? You have personal worldview, but what is your research worldview? And can you adopt a research design if you were to go back and consult the experts, the research methodologists on this? What were they using? What has been done before in terms of, a qualitative research design? So again, I'm seeing constructivism come through thick and fast. Then the research strategies, or what am I going to employ? What is my toolkit? What kind of qualitative research design can I be even more explicit? And from the training I received through the ADA, I now had that language around, well, there's qualitative research, which is an umbrella term, but what are the approaches to qualitative research, or the synthesized approaches that I became more and more familiar with? So what were my options? I could choose, how to answer the research question using a number of those options. I landed on grounded theory as the entire methods package, and within that there are 4 variants. Again, I decided to go back after I submitted that proposal in 2017 and looked at what I needed to improve on. And the big thing for me there was the overall the philosophical worldview. Then I could start to see how was I seeing the problem. Problems can be viewed from a number of different perspectives, but how, according to the lens or the worldview, which I call the lens, and I'm sorry if you guys can't see me right now because I get quite animated in my hand movements, but essentially the glasses that I would wear. How would I see the problem, and therefore how could I ask a research question, and from that, what design would I be using to essentially answer that major or central research question. Are we still good on that front, Emelsha? Are we still fine?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so 2017 to 2020 was a big learning curve for me. Notice the change. Now, what happens behind the scene, colleagues, you may be a supervisor out there, you may be a prof, deepest respect to you and our ethics committee, if they're out there as well. But one of the things that I wasn't told, and no one's fault at all, was just me kind of meandering through this methodological maze, so to speak, is that it's kind of a big deal to have a title, right? To be rubber stamped with a title to the project, but then you go into the field and you find out, especially with qualitative research, oh my word, I'm now following what we call leads, I'm exploring, it's an emergent or iterative design. So come to find out, so many changes happened, including the massive title change that you now see from 2017 all the way to 2020. And now we see another title change that we latched onto, that I put forward to my supervisory team to say, look, I honestly believe that this particular process that I have adopted in terms of the congruency of what I'm wanting to produce here, which is ultimately generate a grounded theory, this particular title, from being in the field, from actually being boots on the ground, is more representative of what actually happened. So we adopted this, and that's what we put forward on that final product of my dissertation, which went and was examined. I passed my defense, and the defense, occurred on the 21st of December, so late last year. I'm really grateful to my supervisory team, Prof. Wayne and Prof. Krobler, for being there all the way. So Prof. Krobler and I were sitting in the Sports Science Department committee room in the evening to accommodate our international examiners. And what an incredible experience, colleagues. I was a little bit nervous as the day got started in the morning. And then I had this incredible peace about it. And I was like, you know what, Deb, you've put on the hard yards. Let's go and have a conversation, kind of like what I'm having with you now. Have a conversation with, be diplomatic, be respectful, but really tell the examiners your story. And at the end of it, they can engage with you and ask you those pertinent questions. But that was it. That photograph of the tennis court, again, was a photograph I took actually in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when I was training and coaching in that particular area one summer, a beautiful summer's day. And it's all kind of connected from my personal story as a tennis player, co-constructed with these young tennis players in South Africa as well. So there's a beautiful thread of my researcher positioning, if you read between the lines, coming through thick and fast. So the reason for the blank sheet here, that's intentional, because now we get into some of the slides that were shown to my examiners, where I showed them, that I heavily invested in a lot of the research prior to entering the field. Now, one of the things that I came to find out later on as I'm going through this, that as a budding grounded theorist, so what does that mean, Deb? That's a great question. So I'm a budding qualitative researcher, but then I adopted this one particular approach to qualitative research, and there's been a contentious, I would say, area of contention over the years to say, well, how should scholars, especially early career researchers, how do they employ grounded theory as was intended by the founding fathers, so to speak? So Glaser and Strauss, they took a very sort of objective approach. And there was contention around, you shouldn't read very much. You shouldn't have this large body of research or understanding going into the field. It must be, kind of exploratory, but that you can't get away with that, colleagues, if you're a PhD student or a master student, because technically with the templates that we're asked to follow, we need to show, and 100% I agree with this to a large extent, that you need to follow a certain order. And to follow that order, you need to have a good understanding of at least the broad topical areas in the literature. So, and I'll come back to that because this became a hot topic actually in my examination process, and then also in my defense, where my examiners were very polite and diplomatic, but we didn't see eye to eye on some of these, discussions around the large body of, literature that could have been or should have been or might have been in my final product. But again, I'll touch on that a little bit later. But at the end of the day, with the journey that I took, I stopped reading when I went to the field to conduct grounded theory and collect data, which led me to, being able to refine and explore what was really going on behind the scenes. So again, now I had a bit of a clearer view. I was no longer in this maze. Yes, I was exploring. Yes, I was being surprised, but I had a good grasp of the design of what I could do with the toolkit that was at my disposal. So I started to notice that tennis players, and I noticed this right from the beginning of the project, I just changed the perspective or the lens through which I saw the problem, but the problem was nonetheless there. So tennis players are not making the transition. Well, I know that, Deb, they're not. So where are they going? So are they dropping out? No. Notice the language has changed now, using the language of transition. 4 professional tennis players are currently on the ATP or professional tour, and 3 are from the Western Cape. But what happens when they go, what happens after high school, so to speak? So what is happening in the development process, that was my central research question, of a competitive junior tennis player in the Western Cape? And the sub-questions, notice the what questions. I'm not after the why questions, I'm after the what questions. And this all comes with the training that I received, thankfully through the ADA, of being able to script user-friendly questions that are appropriate, so to speak, for a qualitative project. You're not wanting to measure anything, even though there's a lot of performance criteria that could come into the project, such as their ranking milestones, how many hours on the court, off the court, all the things that have been done before, so to speak, in the Western literature. I wanted to not steer completely clear of, but make a mark in saying I'm really after the layered person who happens to also be an extraordinary tennis player. So what is happening on and off the court in the development of these players? What are the transitional processes? The language of dropout is now gone. So that conclusion that I had prior to entering the field was not a legitimate one, in terms of it didn't align with my philosophical worldview, because it couldn't. I couldn't have a grounded theory study design based upon, a presupposition. I needed to not unlearn what I'd learned, but I needed to be open to be surprised. As Kathy Sharma, as one of our founding pioneers of constructivist grounded theory, would say, ask the grounded theorist question, which is, what is actually happening here? What is the larger story? What are you after? Are you after the numbers, or are you after the layers, the deeper meanings, the subjective implications of these people's world, which happen to be tennis players? So I took that, what I call my memos, my methodological journaling, and I mapped it out for myself. So the scholars within sports science, I can think of one name in particular that I kept on coming back to, and that was Professor Nicholas Holt out of Canada. And he's very explicit in his writing around, how, specifically sports scientists trying to employ grounded theory haven't done over the years a very good job. He calls it cherry picking. So what the idea then is that you adopt or you employ a particular research methodology, but you're not explicit around, what variant you've chosen, not explicit around, who are the founding fathers of that and why you chose another one, whatever the case may be. And at the end of the day, you're not even producing a theory. So in terms of a substantive theory or a lower range theory, not a higher order theory like your relativity or systems theory, you're essentially producing or generating a theory with theoretical explanation. So if that's not your intent, then the idea then, colleagues, is not to follow a grounded theory through process and product. So I had to make sure that by the end of my process, I had to produce two things. I had to produce a dissertation that was worthy, so to speak, of being awarded a PhD. I'm waiting on two very important meetings right now. It's gone through the examination process, waiting on faculty board and the Senate for that. And then if all goes well there, then I'll be able to officially graduate. So I'm still part of that, in production mode, so to speak. But the product itself of generating a theory or theoretical explanation has already been done within the project. So I can say I followed in many respects using what we call standards of validation within qualitative research to double check that I've actually done this congruently and coherently, and have trustworthiness, as we also call, as opposed to and trustworthiness and transferability. So here we go. I'm rambling on, but let me get back to this particular slide. So I was explicit around my philosophical worldview, social constructivism, and I was able to employ this within the sporting arena. So I'm looking for the deeper meanings, the interpretations, the understanding of, development but transitions within sport, but specifically within tennis. I employed a qualitative research design. The strategy I used was grounded theory, but specifically one of the four major ones, which is social constructivist or variant, the social constructivist variant. It's both a process and a product. How did I go about data collection? Through observation and interviewing. I specifically used to the T, I believe, with data analysis, Kathy Sharma's coding system. I co-constructed the data with the participants. The written report was flexible, and I must reiterate that. It was a first-person narrative explanation, essentially, of the entire process, which again came up in my examination process around, academic writing. How does that tie into, a scholarly piece of work? And this is how I mapped out, essentially, when you called upon to be explicit around, for your examiners in particular, but just for me as I was growing in this very very interesting methodology that I'd chosen. I needed to make sense of it for myself. So I would map it out, I would draw it out, and come to find out these maps or tables or charts, we call them visual displays in qualitative research. And because we're pretty renowned for being long-winded in some respects with our language around qualitative research, it's certainly helpful for us to have a lot of visual displays of how we map this out, how we think. It almost reminds me of in my math class in primary and high school. You would be asked to show how you arrived at the solution. So you get points or marks for not only having the correct answer, but how you went about problem solving. This is my way of essentially problem solving my project. So again, all the way through, I was aiming for congruency and coherency all the way through. Very explicit around my sampling techniques, very explicit around obviously my participants. And again, this was another big thing that came out from my journey, colleagues, at the onset. And if you've attended any of Prof. Wayne's workshops, when we've chatted about sampling, it's a very interesting discussion around how, what numbers are we looking for qualitative research. And, at the proposal stage, when you've got ethics that you're needing to get approval from, you generally give ballpark figures. And sometimes it's hard for a quantitative researcher and vice versa, qualitative, to get their mind around, You know, there's no hard and fast rule for qualitative sampling strategies. But if you can be explicit around, you know, if you've adopted, for example, a grounded theory, you would use theoretical sampling, which is not the same as your regular sampling techniques, because you're not looking for data saturation. You're looking for saturation of your categories, which then when you elevate those, you elevate them to generate that particular theory or theoretical explanation. So again, what was underpinned in this whole process was my observational work, followed by semi-structured interviews, quite a bit of time, in fact, in the field, and then getting onto the fun stuff, colleagues, to go through the data analysis and the data, well, first of all, collection and then analysis, using the entire methods package from Kathy Sharma's was super helpful. So the practical guides, going through and essentially building in what we call trustworthy strategies all the way through to make sure that you are, in fact, being systematic in your approach to qualitative research. Now, you know, one could say, well, Deb, you know, qualitative research, it's exploratory, it's iterative. Why do you need so much structure? Well, when you're a PhD student, learning the ropes, so to speak, you are essentially asked to be explicit, or at least from my understanding, I wanted to be explicit in the process, and I was able to go back and use these techniques that I learned about in ADA with all the workshops I attended, ways and means of having a more systematic and rigorous approach, but even in documenting the journey. So things like keeping a methodological journal, being able to take those screenshots of what you're doing. Obviously, not showing who your participants are. At that particular point, no name should be, on your devices. They should be given pseudonyms or numbers or codes. And this is how essentially the process unfolded, colleagues. So again, unpacking Kathy Sharma's approach to data collection, data analysis. You essentially are looking for these categories, but essentially these codes, but then the focus codes that will be elevated to be these particular categories that underpin this theoretical model. So what's difficult for me now is in this our workshop where I arrived horribly late, so I've taken away quite a bit of your time, which I apologize for, but this particular slide doesn't do the coding process that I adopted justice. So I want to really make explicit here on the process of this journey that if you are explicit with yourself and from the outset, what methods package, which we call the methods package you've adopted, then be explicit all the way through. I could have done thematic analysis. I could have done all kinds of wonderful, had wonderful tools of analyzing data. But I, as a novice researcher, I wanted to go about it the way that I had learned from the pioneer herself. So, for example, Kathy Sharma didn't use, to the best of my knowledge, even computer software. So some of my younger colleagues, including myself, we questioned this, and I decided, for my project, for my first big project, my PhD, I'd like to try hand coding and pen and pencil, pen and paper. And what I did was obviously I interviewed my participants, all 34 of them, 22 of those were tennis players. And I focused the 22, I focused essentially on the 22 tennis players and used the other, what I call the role players, as a way and means to test the data, which is called abduction in grounded theory. So I would draw, the theory would be built upon this coding process of these 22 tennis players, but then I would go back and I would test out the data, which is a form of, theoretical abduction. through grounded theory techniques. But essentially what I'm trying to get, the point across, which I followed the data analysis package of Kathy Sharma's from the get-go. So I had my transcripts. I printed out my transcripts I narrowed the margins down, narrow margins, and then I would do, in the right-hand column, draw a line down on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side, I would also draw a line down on the left-hand side, right-hand side, and have my memos on the one side. So memos with the right-hand side, memos of my reflections around, what is happening? What is the larger story here? Initial codes will be on the left-hand column. And then what I did was I did 2 rounds of initial coding. So from the transcripts, I put these codes back into an Excel spreadsheet. And, Prof. Wayne encouraged me over the years to say, Deb, there's been a lot of talk around ways in which you want to collect data through qualitative research. And one of the major tools or techniques we use is through interviewing. But there's been, a bit of banter around, should you go and really design a semi-structured interview protocol and then follow interview 1 a certain way, follow interview 2 a certain way. And he said, essentially when it comes down to data analysis, it would actually be helpful to have it slightly more structured. So meaning that I asked the questions to each participant in a structured way, but I allowed for the probes. I allowed for them to be given a platform to really unravel their stories. But that being said, the major interview questions I was able to then put into my Excel spreadsheet data inventory device that I used. So that wasn't my software, it was a way of keeping track, which I was able to actually, from this particular slide, I was able to build into those focus codes using in vivo codes, so actual quotations from the participants themselves, and come up with these 8 major categories, and then you have your subcategories as well. So this is now getting into the nitty-gritty of the project, and I'm very conscious of the time at the moment, but essentially this, colleagues, was the model that was generated from or co-constructed from our particular project. And it's not a model that is reflective of what can be imitated and then put into practice later on. No, it is a model that is reflective and is specific to tennis players within the Western Cape, specifically men, who have already gone through the process. It is a retrospective look at their life stories, at their stories of tennis development and transitions. Now, what's interesting here is just to touch on what this means for those of us that are or aren't tennis players or familiar with grounded theory. Essentially, the big running theme for me, when I say theme, I must be careful around the language I use with qualitative research, but I could say the common thread throughout this whole project was, again, from the onset, I thought these young guys were dropping out of the sport. Come to find out, they had a very mature head on their shoulders. A lot of them did. They were thinking about the future, and many of them were using tennis as a vehicle to better their lives. So the green on the model represents South Africa. The color was supposed to be almost like a clay court color, represents, the European circuit or the overseas circuit. With these young guys, what is actually happening behind the scenes is they need to play within their province, play within the country, play on the continent, and then travel, to literally parts of Europe and the USA. But the irony of the whole thing, essentially for me, was to understand that they were not familiar even with the surfaces that they were asked to play tournaments on. Now, those tournaments costing tens of thousands of South African rand, sometimes traveling, out of mom and dad's pocket, so to speak, sometimes traveling alone. So the whole team dynamic that they would get in college, which I myself experienced, coming from a semi-professional background in collegiate tennis, it was a very different path. So many of them were actually not wanting to, they made the decision to not want to go pro, but use tennis as a vehicle to better their lives, go the collegiate route. So yeah, we see college driving the tennis vehicle, and using it essentially to become what I said at the top there. This was one of the major categories that came out, which is a beautiful picture of what was really happening. Being a pro at life, not tennis. They would say things to me, Deb, I love the sport of tennis. I didn't quit the sport. I just grew up. I matured. I chose to do something else. What I love about these subcategories, colleagues, I can get into this all day, but I won't bore you with all the details. But what was so nice about, in many respects, the unpacking of this model, the unpacking of these journeys, so to speak, was these subcategories really do some of the major categories justice. So for example, life orbiting tennis. So essentially what I was finding was these young guys would say things to me, Deb, being asked to and wanting to play tennis when I was in primary school and high school, it became a job at a very young age. And I didn't get the chance to be a regular schoolboy. I didn't have a normal childhood. So these were 22 young guys, doing marvelous things right now in their lives. Some of them are professional tennis players, some chose that path. But what really stood out to me was their vulnerability. And I would never have been able to get the wealth of their journeys and of their lived experiences if I didn't do this qualitative project. And also if I didn't adopt a particular grounded theory in order to do that. So it really unpacks what is happening in the journey, all the way from the focus codes, or the initial codes, 2 rounds of initial codes, to focus codes, then these 8 major categories, and then the subcategories that fall underneath them, so only 4 of those. So essentially what I had produced, I did in fact produce a dissertation, and I did in fact produce a grounded theory, which is called South African men's tennis player transition processes within and out of the professional player pathway. Notice the little diverged path in the background there. All right, so as we wrap this up, and I'm going to leave quite a considerable amount of time for questions and hopefully some rigorous discussions, is lessons learned from the journey. So I'd like to just take a moment and unpack some of the bullet points that I've made here, and that is, this took me 6 years, colleagues. I was in America for 12 years. I registered. I had to come back to the country, so I don't want to bore you with all the details, but I had to, my H-1B visa was on the brink of expiry. Had to make a hard and fast choice. Had to, pack my bags in my early 30s and start over, which I, by a lot of grace it happened. I enrolled in a PhD project, but then also the year after that, I was offered a job and applied for a full-time job at Stellenbosch University in the sports science department. And I was shortlisted and got the full-time position. It was actually quite a surprise to me. I had a love for academia after teaching 3 years in the States. But I tell you that because the full-time job that I had, which I love being at Stellies and I love teaching in our department, but I found that I would, this is my vulnerability, would make excuses, or I would say things like, Deb, your students or your colleagues or your job right now as a budding academic is more important than this PhD. This is what you have to do after hours, which is totally fine. But the point that I'm making is, I myself was not just producing a product. I was part of that production process. And this little epiphany, as we say, we see things, 2020 in hindsight. So much of 6 years of my life, essentially, was invested in this process. And would I do it again? Absolutely. Would it have taken 6 years? I wouldn't want to do it another 6 years of it. But I would, if I had it all over again, I would say yes to it. But then I would have a conversation with my my younger self, I guess, to say things like be open to change and possibility. When you're given, this is where I think, as a early career researcher helping now to supervise projects of my own with my honors students, the things that I would tell them, I tell myself, is that with qualitative research, yes, there are many boxes that we have to tick in terms of institution, and quite rightly so. But, with qualitative research, if you really are doing, and I say really are, in brackets or inverted commas there, if you're really embarking on a qualitative research project, you've got to realize that you will be surprised most of the time. And the institutional tick boxes, though fair and scholarly and academic, and I respect them, I myself have to comply with those. But I'm a dreamer, I'm a visionary, I can't really help that part of who I am. So I do question the status quo, so to speak. I always have, and hopefully always will, but be a little bit more diplomatic as I do that, is to say the process will change. It has to change. When you enter the field and you're immersed in the worlds of your participants, we have this lovely adage in qualitative research where we say you transfer the mantle of authority from yourself. You are supposed to be, a budding expert, but you transfer the mantle of authority from yourself, from the researcher, to your participants, and they become the experts. So there's a beautiful trade-off to where you submit to that process. You humble yourself to the process and be open to change. And through that process, though long and hard and challenging, you become, I would imagine I have become better for it. Develop broad shoulders and deep roots. So I thought my root system was pretty deep. I still think it's pretty deep, according to living in alignment with my own personal worldview. But what I didn't anticipate was, and no one can really teach you this or tell you this, you have to experience it yourself, was, for example, when people come across your path, I'm talking about experts, come across your path, like my examiners, like my supervisory team, they're not there to criticize you as the person. They are there to offer critique for the process and the product that is being produced. However, because you are part of that process and product, many times, myself included, especially when you're vulnerable, when you're tired, and you're working on this stuff in the early mornings and late at night because you got a full load in the day, we can become, or we could become quite reactive. So instead of proactive, develop those broad shoulders early on, and when the critiques come, try and adopt, at least my encouragement would be to adopt a reflective approach. Now granted, we can't control how the experts or our supervisors or examiners will interact with us, but we can certainly control how we respond. And again, on that note, it leads me to the next point, where what I really did not anticipate, and I'm so grateful that I had this entire process on this journey, was I didn't know what to expect from the examination process. Here I'm sitting with a very large document of the very, in-depth, it was quite remarkable actually, the in-depth constructive feedback that all of my examiners provided for me. And now when you've just submitted the document, you're waiting 8 weeks or so for their feedback. There's this, for me at least, there was this nervous energy around, I hope it went well, hopefully they understood. And my focus at the time was, I really want to feel understood, naturally, right? You've been with this project for 6 years. But what I didn't anticipate was in their feedback, and as I even read through it now, they really took the time to read the entire document, what came through, a lot. They were invested in my development. They were invested in my, potential publications that could come out of this, which that's the intention. So what I could, hopefully the advice that I can give you is see them even from the onset. So start with the end in mind. You know you're going to be examined. You know you're going to have to give a defense. The defense is not a formality in terms of just a formality. The defense is a part. If you're at Stellenbosch University, the defense is part of the examination process. So be sure that you know, if I can be confident in saying this, that you start to adopt a broad shoulder, so to speak, but also to see that your examiners really are there to assist you in becoming a better scholar, researcher, and essentially, you know, your PhD, if someone told me once, which I really latched onto this, your PhD is like your driver's license. So you may be able to drive, essentially, but are you allowed to get onto the road? Well, we have those questions. I have that question now. You've got, you know, some big committees that this thing has to go through. And the hope is that essentially I will be able to get onto the road and drive safely with my PhD driver's license. But the moral of the story, colleagues, is to really, you know, don't lose sight of the fact that you are part of the process. You're part of that product. Be open to change and possibility, and really encourage you to develop those broad shoulders and deep roots. And then your examiners, I want to actually talk a little bit more around this in the Q&A. But so much can be said around that final hurdle. And it's ironic because when we're tired, when we're vulnerable, you've got to go through that last little push, that last maybe couple of big hurdles, which I had, and you know, by grappling with their thoughts and their constructive feedback, I was able to produce a much better, well-rounded, I believe, document for the long run, that hopefully some publications can come out of it. And some really good things have come out of it as well already, where I've been asked like this to talk about my story, and hopefully inspire someone else to stay motivated and to finish, to stick with the race and keep running the race, as some, you know, wisdom literature would tell us, keep running the race with perseverance. So that's all from me. Hopefully I have not kept you over. We got 1 minute to go until I'm actually done. I apologize again for, not being able to log on and you see my lovely animated responses with all the hand waving that I do while I present. But Melsh, I'm going to open up to the floor, back to you, and then we can take it from there.
Thank you so much, Deb.
Yeah,
this was definitely an interesting exercise, firstly, but also thank you very much for your presentation. It was great for us to, you know, hear the journey you went through, and I know a lot of the delegates that have joined us are definitely taking a lot from your experience. So I would like to open up the floor for questions now. I think you can all still see my screen. In your menu function, you should see a Q&A message box. So if you could just post your questions there, I will start off and ask Deb what we've got here. Okay. So Deb, the first question we have, how did you capture the factors that have contributed to the development process outside the formal transformational process? Deb, can you see my screen? Probably not.
No.
Okay, so I'm just going to read it because I don't think I can double share a screen. I think that might just be a bit weird. So Charlie's asked how you capture the factors that have contributed to the development process outside the formal transformational process.
Could Charlie elaborate on that? So are we going with context of my tennis project, or are we going with transformational factors? I'm not really understanding the context there. So we talked about development and transformation. Was that my transformation or how the project transformed and developed? Okay, does that make sense?
Okay, yeah, we'll wait. Charlie, if you could just type an elaboration to your question, please. Then we have a question from Nixon Mweni. So he says, congratulations first. And he says, thank you for informative dissertation journey. Just more clarification on the qualitative data analysis. When you adopted the Sharma's coding system, how friendly was it? Is the analysis integrated software such as NVivo?
Okay, so how user-friendly was the grounded theory process for coding? Was that what I understood?
Yeah, Sharma's coding system.
I love that question. Thank you so much, colleague. So essentially, what I must be honest with you, of all the variants that I came across, Kathy Sharma's. Well, let me give you some context. Maybe it will help you. So Kathy Sharma's, she was a PhD student, I believe, of Glaser and Strauss, one of the two, who were the original founding fathers. Hospital setting back in the 70s. But if you are familiar with the time period, it was very satisfying in quantitative thought. So your objective reasoning. So therefore you start to see their variance differs a lot from Kathy Sharma. She came out of that.
Oh, Deb, can you give me a second? Sorry, they can't hear you anymore. I did something stupid. Sorry. It was my fault. Sorry. I think they should be able to hear you now. Yeah, please go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, colleagues, sorry about that. Okay, so just back to the Kathy Sharma's coding system. Just to give you some context, which was super helpful for me, was to understand the time period and the context around Kathy Sharma's coming out of the Glaser and Strauss, essentially, school of thought. So back in the day, in the 1960s, 1970s, in the healthcare system in the United States, they were asking, they being Glaser and Strauss, were asking questions around death and dying, qualitatively, but essentially still wanting, rigor around getting to, the process of, death and dying in these hospital settings. Kathy Sharma's was a product of that particular school of thought at the time, but she then came out and was a pioneering voice in the constructivist variant, not the paradigm, but the variant of co-constructing and generating this theoretical model, theoretical understanding with the participants themselves. So to be very explicit, when we say grounded theory, the idea then is that we select a variant, or at least what I'm proposing, and Prof. Wayne has backed me on this. He's the grounded theory guru, so to speak, Prof. Wayne Babchek. He's backed me on being explicit, especially as a doctoral student or a master's student or early career researcher. Be explicit on the variant. So I did that. I said I'm using Kathy Sharma's, but I used her coding system to the T. So with your initial codes, then your focus codes, and then to use the term of abduction, I was able to elevate those particular codes to the categories, reach theoretical saturation, and then develop the theory from there, tested against the role players like your coaches, administrators, and parents. To answer your question, in detail, the software out there right now that is user friendly, I understand that Atlas TI is quite good, as well as Max QDA. So I know Prof. Wayne and his colleagues at Nebraska use Max QDA, but I don't know what that software, if you're a novice researcher, and we're all pretty much in that boat if you're a doctoral student, how that would assist you. So essentially and I'm being long-winded for a reason here, colleagues, so bear with me. What you don't want to happen, and I could see this, throughout the ADA courses that I've assisted with, that colleagues will come with questions around software, but it's not a shortcut. If you're looking at it as a shortcut, it's not going to work for you, because you start getting into or at least you could get into the habit of still counting of the metrics around the coding process. So I would encourage you to get a good handle of pen and paper coding first, and then you can start to, dive into or explore, the software as well. But I'm happy to share, I believe, there are Excel, kind of like an Excel spreadsheet that Prof. Wayne, I can get his permission and see if he's willing to share, his Excel spreadsheet, but the template that I used, that was super helpful. But you can essentially create a template that's slightly more structured to help with this bigger inventory of coding, where your memos can be housed as well. Does that make sense, or is it?
Perfect, Deb. Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm going to ask this question here. How did you handle the issue of researchers' bias and objectivity in your research?
I love that. I love that question. So researcher bias and objectivity. So this is where the training at ADA came in so handy, because what I learned was that within a particular approach of an approach to qualitative research, such as phenomenology, some of the big emphasis in phenomenology is being able to bracket yourself out depending upon the variant that you're using in phenomenology, right? So Max van Manen is one of those, one of the scholars behind phenomenology, but again, different variants. In terms of objectivity and bracketing, or my researcher bias, I brought that into the project. So throughout the project, I reported in or wrote in first person, acknowledging and being explicit around my philosophical underpinning, my researcher positioning, and the iterative approach around that. So the intention was not to be objective. I did not attain objectivity for the purpose of this particular design, right? So how I struggled or how I dealt with my biases, I reflected on those, but I didn't want to discard them, reflected in my methodological journals. But the point is, with co-constructing, when you co-construct the eventual product that is the granite theory, you don't want to bracket yourself out. That is the entire process of data analysis. You are co-constructing. So for example, one of the comments from my examiners, which is brilliant, they said to me, Deb, in your methodological section, you've got the section now which you've called your autoethnography. So looking at yourself through the lens of researcher, but adding to that researcher positioning. The encouragement from two of the examiners, one on the topic of autoethnography, and the other one was my researcher positioning. Deb, you could collapse this section, because this forms part of a larger section in the earlier part of chapter 3, my methodology section, where you can expound upon the fact that you yourself were a collegiate tennis player. How does that play into your researcher positioning? So that's what I did. I took the examiner's advice and I collapsed my chapter 3 to took away autoethnography, because autoethnography, through this particular examiner and his standards of what we call validation, is to say that there are certain standards of validation that my particular section that I called autoethnographic work didn't comply with the broader, strategies of doing autoethnography. But what I could say, it's an extension of my journey as a collegiate tennis player. So to go back to answer your specific question, I didn't want to be objective from the outset, because that wasn't my philosophical underpinning. And I didn't have to bracket myself out like some of the other approaches to qualitative research, because the whole point was to co-construct my experiences, acknowledging that I also had a collegiate experience, but allow the platform to be given to the experts, which were my tennis players. Very long-winded, but hopefully that makes sense. Yes.
Thanks, Deb. I think we have time for maybe about 2 more questions. There's another one from Charlie. So he says,
yes,
in relation to how the players develop and transform, could there be mediating factors and moderating factors as well that could have been left out? How did you control these?
Yes, so I love that question from Charlie. So, Charlie, I want to bring your attention to, if I may, to the language around control, the language around factors. And the reason I allude to that is because those very similar language that was raised within, me grappling with some of the examiner feedback as well. Not so much the language around control. So the reason I bring your attention to the language of those questions is because it leads me to think around the language of quantitative research and objectivity. So again, it goes back to a positivistic or post-positivistic worldview, which I did not adopt from the beginning. So again, the congruency of the project from start to finish, I adopted a constructivist paradigm, right? I co-constructed with my particular participants. So yes, there could be, if I wanted to have a look at other mediating factors, the next best thing could have been, should have been, as the could haves and should haves are out there, a mixed methods project where I could have looked at and controlled for a massive amount of quantitative elements like ranking, like stages of development, like time spent on and off the court. But I did not want to look at that because it had been done before in the West. I wanted to have a pure qualitative study where I looked at the experiences, the lived experiences of the tennis person who also happened to be the tennis player. So I don't have a lot of time now, and I might not be doing your question justice, Charlie, so I apologize for that. But it really goes back to the language around qualitative research, but on a deeper level, the philosophical paradigms that underpin the entire research process. So there's a way that we could look at the problem, the same problem, but we could look at it through a different philosophical lens. And the how you look at it through a different philosophical lens will then determine your research question and the way in which you adopt a best fit, which is your approach to qualitative research or approach to research, which then inevitably will answer that research question. Hopefully that makes sense, Charlie.
Thank you, yes. Deb. This one is probably a pretty straightforward one. Someone has asked, what is the name of the publication by, I think they said Kathy Sharma, but I think Kathy Sharma is.
Yes, so great question. So the name of the publication, colleagues, is Constructing Grounded Theory, a second edition, and Kathy Sharma is spelled with a K, K-A-T-H-Y, and then Sharma with a C, H-A-R-M-A-Z, or for our American guests, Z. So Kathy Sharma's Constructing Grounded Theory.
So I think we can do one more question. There's quite a few, but unfortunately, I don't think we're going to get to everything. So Topazile says, congratulations. How does one get to appreciate one's worldview, research philosophy? And then he says, I hope I got that right. What material can you recommend? I've read Cresswell, but I'm having a challenge, seriously hopeless, applying what I read, so that I can then be able to move to the next steps. For example, the design and so forth. I can't connect philosophy to the tools and techniques, in short.
Sure, that's a great question. Let me give it a little bit of thought. I've got resources that have come through from, the courses that I myself have been involved with. I know Bogdan and Bicklin do some great work on the philosophical underpinnings. You've got the scholars called Cresswell and Poth, P-O-T-H, Cresswell and Poth. So Cresswell's written, on his own, but then he's also collaborated with colleagues. So Cresswell and Poth is a good one. And then you've got Cresswell and Goodeman. You have the 2019 version, which I'm trying to find. It's called Educational Research, Planning, Conducting, and Evaluating Quantitative and Qualitative Research. And I can certainly make that sort of list available to Amalsha and maybe email it out to our guests. Yeah.
Yes, I can do that. Okay, I think maybe one more. What is the difference between constructivism and social constructivism? Did you use both?
Social constructivism. To be honest with you, I don't know, in fact. I know that they are connected, but the whole purpose for me was the idea that I could incorporate my own interpretation. So I wasn't bracketing or taking myself out of the study. I was very explicit around my researcher positioning, which came to the fore in unraveling my own tennis player journey. But the irony of the whole thing, colleagues, was the fact that I didn't give the collegiate tennis route for the men's tennis players much thought. And so that was surprising to me when I was able to listen to their stories and interpret what their meanings were. That was super surprising. So social constructivism, the ability to really interpret and ideally the celebration is what comes to mind in looking back at it now, through that particular paradigm. You're celebrating the subjectivity of the process. So that's where the language around constructivism and co-constructing comes to the fore, because you don't want to take yourself out as a researcher. You are front and center, but again, giving the mantle of authority to your experts, the participants, and then generating a theory. But the way you see it, the way you interpret it, the way you interpret their experiences and co-construct with them, comes into play all throughout the study. Hopefully that makes sense.
Thanks, Deb. There's someone who would like to connect with you on research.
Yes.
If you're okay with it, I'd like to maybe connect the two of you, and then you can take it further. And then to end off quickly, just quickly from you, your lowest and highest points in your journey. Wonderful.
Yummy.
So sorry for that again, Deb. If you can just quickly go through your lowest and highest points, and I think we will call it from there.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you again, colleagues. So let's start with my lowest points. My lowest points, I think, was, the self-doubt that I experienced, and I should have actually normalized it throughout the process, because I felt honestly overwhelmed with not having a research background. So in the methodological maze that I was referring to earlier, I could somehow, many times get hung up on trying to feel or want to feel understood. But as the process, unfolded, I realized that, I had to first grapple with and understand, the intricacies of it. And when I got a hold of that, then I built my confidence, which led to the highest points. And that is really, in terms of self, me in the process and becoming part of the product. The highest point for me was like, wow, anything is possible. And looking back on the journey now, how people have come alongside to support is a huge high point. And then also just celebrating, like, this is a huge accomplishment in many respects. But now the really you can start to use these platforms to give back and to really inspire other people. So those are some of the biggest high points for me, is to try and add value to budding researchers out there, which hopefully I can do.
Yeah, I think that's actually the best way to end this off, because that's exactly what you've done today with your session. So thank you so much, Deb. There are so many comments in the chat and in the Q&A where people are thanking you for what a beautiful presentation you've done, and giving them insight into the journey. So also from us at the ADA, Deb, thank you very much, and all to the delegates as well. Thank you so much for joining us today. This will be posted on our YouTube channel. So for anyone who would like to maybe share it with anyone else or go back to it, it will be uploaded this afternoon. And yeah, thanks. And also we've got our autumn school, which is open for applications as well. So please visit our website And a lot of these courses that Deb has taken, we still do offer them. So please do come back to our website. And yeah, we look forward to welcoming you hopefully to an ADA school. And lastly, again, thank you so much, Deb. Thanks for navigating this technological issue-filled afternoon with me. I appreciate you. Thank you.
I appreciate you, and I really appreciate this opportunity, and thank you for your patience. It's literally never happened to me before, and hopefully the colleagues got something out of it. And I am around. Please, you're welcome to share my email address. I'm happy to take questions, happy to share. Always a pleasure to get involved and help where I can.
Thanks, Deb. Thank you very, very, very much. Yeah, enjoy the rest of your afternoon, everybody. Thank you again for joining us.
Awesome. Thanks, colleagues. Thanks, Anasha. Thanks to the team. Bye.
Bye.